Hey everybody. So what we're going to talk about today are legumes. And most of you probably know them better by just beans and peas. I do want to give you a little bit of a botanical background into beans because they do belong to the Fabaceae family, and the fruit is actually a legume or a pod. When we talk about the importance of legumes, you've heard me mention these benefits many, many times, but just a few things to make mention of. That they are second only to grasses in their importance to humans and even our domestic animals. And every major civilization in the world has been based on a legume crop as well as a cereal grain crop. And again, by definition, all of these plants are going to be members of Fabaceae or the legume family. And there's about 18,000 species that belong to this family. I tried to list a few of these here. You can see there's a multitude of these. This is not all by any means of the imagination, but I just tried to put some down here that I figured many of you had probably grown in your gardens or maybe have experimented with it at some point. So do remember that peanuts are also going to fall into this category of legumes. So you can see where soybeans and peanuts kind of fall. Then we have our pulses, or what we refer to as dried beans and peas, and then chickpeas and lentils, and then fresh peas and fresh beans. Now to go back to the benefits, nitrogen fixation is huge when it comes to beans and peas, because we know that that's where we get that association with the rhizobium bacteria, which lives in the nodules on the roots. So basically what they're doing is taking that atmospheric nitrogen from the air, and they're fixing that into the roots basically as a form of free fertilizer. So when we think about flowering plants, they can't use that atmospheric nitrogen. They have to be able to absorb that through the root system. So if you click on this link in the slideshow, it'll give you a little bit of an idea how all of this kind of works together. But here's just a little schematic to kind of illustrate that for you. So we have this huge nitrogen cycle and all of these associations, and it just is an ongoing cycle. So just keep that in mind. These are the nodules on one of the plants. So this is how they are able to actually freely fix that nitrogen from the atmosphere and utilize it as a form of fertilizer. And they can actually even put that fertilizer back into the soil for future crops. So that's why we will encourage that in the fall to plant these cover crops that are legume species, like the clovers and the vetches. So keep that in mind as well. But we'll talk more about that as we move into late summer. Now, in regards to nutritional value, legumes are going to be high in nitrogen, which makes them rich in protein. And usually that's going to fall into that 20 to 30% range. They are going to contain a little bit of fat, but it's usually going to be less than cereal grains as far as the starch. And you're going to have a lot of amino acids, but the composition is going to vary among these crops as well as from cereal grains, because legumes are actually going to have a little bit more amino acids. Remember from our phytochemistry classes that there are some of these legumes that we have to be real careful about cooking because of some of the toxicities that occur, and lima beans was one of those years ago. You've heard me talk about those glycosides, and we have to cook those out because of those cyanogenic compounds, or basically just cyanide. But oftentimes you'll hear some of these referred to as lectins, which are just resisting digestion in the lining of the intestinal tract. I can't talk today, y'all. There's going to be lots of different kinds of these lectins, but I've listed one here from the kidney beans, because this can actually be toxic in high amounts. And we've even had occurrences of poisoning taking place when kidney beans aren't cooked appropriately. So usually lectins are not going to be high enough to cause symptoms, but I just wanted to put this slide in here so you would kind of be aware of that. Because again, if you go back to lima beans, old-timey cookbooks will make mention of that you need to cook them, boil them like you see here, 212, soak those overnight, continually cook, and then recook them again to make sure you got those alkaloids out of, or the glycosides out of those beans. Just to kind of frame us again, remember that legumes are important to the body, rich in protein, they're fixing nitrogen, and they're going to be easily stored and harvested. Now, some people don't like picking beans. It can be a tedious process, but as far as preserving, pretty easy to can these and be able to eat fresh beans all throughout the winter months. We'll talk a little bit about some of these ancient cultivars and where they came from, because they have come to us from all over the world. As far as the Near East and Europe, we usually will associate peas and broad beans, lentils, and garbanzo beans with that area. Of course, here in the New World, common beans, and we'll talk more specifically about common beans a little bit later, but lima beans and peanuts are going to be very common here. Southeast Asia and China, very popular with the soybeans and the mung beans and ajuki beans. And then in Africa, of course, black-eyed peas and pigeon peas. In regards to lentils, they are going to be one of the oldest domesticated legumes. And as a result of just hybridization and being domesticated for years, for even centuries in some cases, some of these domesticated legumes have lost the ability to reseed themselves, which was really cool, you know, like I say, hundreds of years ago, that they could do this freely, especially in some of those subtropical regions that you'll hear me mention a little bit later. Lentils are going to be high in protein. The other cool feature is that they're drought resistant, which could be a pretty good thing, considering that we're kind of off to a dry start to summer here in Northeast Tennessee, at least. We do have documentation that Egyptian tombs had lentils in them even in 2200 BC. As far as peas, they're going to be an old crop, but they're also a cold crop. And they date back to the Near East about 9,000 years ago. But we do have records that they appeared in Ethiopia and Central Ages as well. And we know that they were an important part of the diet during the Middle Ages in Europe, and still a very important crop, both economically and for food sources there. Now, when we think about green peas, folks did not eat those until about the 1700s, but now are the fourth most important legume crop worldwide. We have broad beans. Those were domesticated in the Near East, and we know that the Greeks and Romans and the Egyptians were utilizing these beans. This was actually the only common bean in Europe before Christopher Columbus came to the New World. And they did spread into Asia, and China is now the world's largest producer of broad beans. The Spanish brought broad beans, which are called habas, to the New World. They are going to perform better in a cooler climate. So Canada, even today, still produces more than we do here in the US. And there's also a link in this slide about favism, if you've ever heard that. It's a genetic disorder. It's kind of a cool little read, so you might want to check that out on people that eat these beans, the fava beans. Garbanzos are also known as chickpeas, more commonly here in the South. They do come from Northeast Africa area. They were cultivated about 7,400 years ago, and then by 2000 BC, they were introduced to India, which now grows about 80% of the world's crop of these. And we owe the Spanish and the Portuguese for bringing these specific peas to us, to the New World. And then soybeans, they actually came about in China. They were cultivated about 7,000 years ago. Actually have literature that dates back to 1000 BC. These are going to be really high in protein and fats and oils, so they're a dual purpose, and well, actually even more than a dual purpose. We get a lot of indirect products from soybeans, and we know that this is a very important crop, especially here in Tennessee, in West Tennessee. We also know, again, indirectly, like in Asia, that they are converting this to miso, tofu, soy milk, curds, cheeses, and even sprouts. So lots of different uses for soybeans. And this is just a picture of soybean harvest utilizing the combines. Sometimes you will hear soybeans simultaneously referred to as soya. So just keep that in mind. So they were introduced to Europe very early, but they never really became popular there. Another cool thing about soybeans is that Ben Franklin was actually able to get some seed and shared those with Thomas Jefferson. So if you've ever been to Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, and are on the grounds there in the garden, you will likely see this soybean grown there. But interestingly enough, even with Thomas Jefferson growing it and Ben Franklin growing it, soybeans didn't really become popular here in the U.S. until the 1940s. And you'll notice there, tofu is going to be one of the major proteins from soybeans. I remember in elementary school, instead of hamburgers, we had the soy burgers. So, you know, it's been used as kind of a reconstituted meat byproduct for years, and even crayons come from soybeans. So there's a lot of indirect usage for the soybean. But anyway, we know tofu, that's really grown in popularity, especially in the last 25 or 30 years here in the US. But interestingly enough, we do produce quite an enormous harvest of soybeans commercially from a production ag standpoint, but over half of that is being exported, especially into Asian and South American countries. And also notice there that soybeans are the most important bean crop in the world. Black-eyed peas, they were domesticated in Western Africa, and they were actually brought here by the slave trade that the Dutch initiated several years ago. We do know that there's other species that have been cultivated in Asia, and we know that this was occurring during Sanskrit times because the Romans and Greeks actually documented that in some of those writings. In regards to here in the U.S., production primarily occurring in Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, and coastal Carolina. The lima beans, we think those were independently domesticated in Mexico and then even northern South America before they started moving southward. We know the oldest cultivated lima beans were from Peru, about 7,000 to 10,000 years old. And of course, again, 1492, Christopher Columbus, we know that cultivation kind of moved from Canada into Argentina, and we still have those trade routes even open today. And you'll notice there, they're listed as a perennial in the tropics, and they were because, again, they were reseeders very prolifically. So that was one reason they were termed a perennial. And of course, that climate lended itself to being able to reproduce. Again, remember that limas are toxic, but most of that here in the U.S. has now been bred out. So you're not having to continually cook those beans to be able to eat those safely. But that was a major issue during colonial times here in the New World. Just a few pictures of some of those primitive lima beans that have been around for years. So we do still have these in production. Of course, this is from Puerto Rico. Just some cool photographs of that. The scarlet runner bean, interestingly, here in the U.S. is primarily grown as a landscape plant. Many will grow this to attract hummingbirds, but it is an ancient cultivar from Mexico, and folks will still eat these. And it is actually a common bean grown and eaten in Europe, which kind of brings us to common beans and all the beans that actually do fall into this category. And you can see there it's a pretty big list. Kidney beans, pintos, navies, black beans, green beans, wax beans, and snaps are all going to belong to Phaseolus vulgaris. So these were actually domesticated in Mexico and South America. They were domesticated several times. We've even got fossils that go back to 7,000 years in Mexico and all the way back to Peru. And just a couple shots there of some navy beans and then kidney beans. And we know that there's a few different species of kidney beans as well. Don't forget about the three sisters. You hear me mention this quite a bit. It was the Native Americans that cultivated the beans with squash and corn. The corn served as a structure to be able to grow these vining crops on. So we do know that beans were cultivated here in all parts of the Americas in 1492. And of course, beans are going to be the second or third most important bean crop in the world. Now, we also have a legume, the peanut. I've mentioned that already. We will sometimes refer to that as groundnut, but bear in mind that there is a true groundnut, which is the Apios family. So a little bit of difference there in regards to how those grow, so don't get those confused. But peanuts or ground nuts, if you call them that, they are native to Central South America. They were domesticated by the Guarani Indians. And then the Portuguese were the ones that actually took peanuts and distributed those worldwide in the early 1500s. And they were widely cultivated in Africa. And it was them during that slave trade again that brought those peanuts back to the New World. Just a peanut and flour, and you notice that flour is going to be very similar on all of our legume species, maybe just different colors and different sizes, but this is pretty indicative of a Fabaceae flour. And of course, peanuts are going to be a different legume species because they're producing that fruit underground, but they are very important to the southeastern U.S. because they grow quite well in sandier soils. They were the crop that kind of came in and replaced cotton in the early 1900s because of the boll weevil that eradicated cotton crops during that time. They are still going to be eaten on a large scale in West Africa and Asia, and they are the second most important legume, but they're not often eaten directly because we know peanut butter is huge. So most of the U.S. production here actually goes into peanut butter. Peanuts are going to contain a lot more oil than most of our other legumes. And just one more thing about, I'm seeing if I have this link in here, I can't see, but aflatoxin, you notice there on that last bullet point, that can be a problem in storage, which can in turn be an issue for human consumption. And just in essence of time, I'm not going to go into that, but there is a link that talks a little bit more in detail about the aflatoxin. So make sure you check that out. It's kind of cool. And here is the Vigna subterranea, which is a groundnut. And then we also have tamarind and carob. Some of you are probably familiar with that. The tamarinds are used in a lot of sauces today. They've got that sticky pulp, lend a sour taste to some food, but a lot of African and Asian dishes will utilize this. And then carob, of course, is going to be primarily known as the chocolate substitute without caffeine. But it's been cultivated in the Near East for thousands of years too, and even used as a livestock food source. Now, when it comes to bush beans versus pole beans, knowing which one's right for you, that's just going to be a matter of opinion, whatever you prefer. I will tell you that pole beans are going to have that extended harvest times. Bush beans are going to have a shorter window, so a lot of folks like to grow those just to be able to can and preserve those a little bit easier. Bush beans are going to lend themselves quite well to raised beds. If you don't have a lot of space, you're not going to have to worry about a structure to trellis those. You're not going to have to incur a lot of expense with that. They're just good old bush beans. You can even grow those in containers. Pole beans are going to require a little bit more oomph on your part. You're going to have to invest in some type of trellising system. You're going to have to be creative oftentimes, depending on what type of pole bean that you do grow. But irregardless of what you're growing or what your purpose is if it's just for snaps or shelly beans or dry beans, you can find a variety out there because there are so many varieties. Now, I will tell you, and you will hear more about this next week when I send you the video that we did last week in Berea, Kentucky with Dr. Bill Best at the Sustainable Mountain Ag Center. He is an expert in heirloom beans and saving seeds. He's been doing it for 60 plus years. And of course that even predated him with his mother and family doing that for years. So you'll hear more about that and the stories associated with these beans next week. But I just want to say here that if you have never eaten a true old-fashioned bean, like a greasy bean or a cut short or a true cornfield bean, y'all have got to find some of those this year and either grow them or purchase them because they are superior in flavor, y'all. You just will not taste anything like them. Now, they do cost more if you do purchase those at a farmer's market, just because, again, that longer growing season, it takes a little bit more in regards to a trellis system. So you're going to pay a little more, but I promise you it's well worth the money spent to try these treasures of the past. And then again, make sure you check in next week and watch that video. I know some of you in Tennessee have already seen that, but for those of you out of state, it's a really good little synopsis of heirlooms and how beans have just made their way to present day and how they came to kind of be. Now, when we get into talking about trellising pole beans, you've got to get creative. It's all going to depend on your system, on what you've got in production, how much expense you want to incur, you know, how much strength, even in some cases, that you've got to create some of these structures. But just a few ideas here to kind of show you. You can use any type of structure. Just get creative. A lot of folks will use the bamboo poles and use just seagrass string or balin twine. These are actual branches from trees. Some people will use hog panels and then just secure those with T-post, because otherwise they'll just bend down because production can get quite heavy on some of these. But you notice here, just, you know, being creative. Bamboo post here, something really small in a raised bed even, or just using old tobacco stakes or tomato stakes and creating a triangle for them to grow in. Just be creative. Lots of different ways that you can trellis these up. As far as soil, we know that soil temp needs to be a little higher for bean seeds to germinate. They can be kind of fussy, but we are definitely there now. And as far as soil, you know, always making sure that your soil baseline soil pH is where it needs to be. Of course, we say that with any crop that you're growing in the garden. You can add organic matter. You know, we always encourage you to do that. But of course, again, legumes are kind of cool because they fix nitrogen from the air and use that as a free form of fertilizer. And again, if we're covering our crops in the fall with a legume, then we're just replacing nitrogen that's been lost or utilized from plants grown there previously. But pretty much like any of our garden sites, we just want a well-drained, medium textured soil. There is going to be a handout about inoculant, whether or not to use that. You can order that by mail, or it's going to be at any of your hardware stores, farm and garden stores. There's, if anybody's familiar with Gardens Alive or Burpee, that's two that come to mind. Many other seed companies are going to have their own brand, but it's virtually inexpensive, and all it is just giving a little boost in regards to that bacteria. It's just going to help that, I guess, that relationship come to life a little bit more. And you cannot use too much of this. So, you know, you don't have to worry about it. You're just basically putting that on your seeds at planting, shaking it around. You're inoculating it, and then you're just planting, and it's just going to make your beans happier throughout the growing season. But anyway, make sure you check out that resource. We get this question all the time. Can you save bean seed? And next week, we're going to go into that a little bit more when you see Bill Best's video as well. But if they're heirloom or open pollinated, you can keep those for seeds. We don't recommend the hybrids because we don't know if they're going to come back true to form. There's no telling what you might get the next year. So we do not recommend saving seeds from hybrids. If you are growing the heirlooms or the open pollinated, keep different varieties apart by about 20 foot because we want to avoid cross-pollination because that can still occur. Now, when you're going to collect these to save, make sure that you gather when the pods are dried, just past that leathery stage. They're just starting to toughen up and they get that thinner, papery white looking pod. The beans need to feel dry. And then actually look your beans. You know, that was a term my grandmother used to use, look your beans. Well, look them over, make sure you don't have any flaws, make sure they're completely dry before storing those in an airtight container. And we recommend putting those in the freezer for storage until you plant those again. Now, I put just a few recommended varieties. This is by and large not all. I just wanted to put a little snapshot with the link to our recommended varieties resource publication, so make sure that you check that out. It's also on the web portal, so refer to that as you're choosing varieties. Now, here is the one picture everybody's probably cussing right now, if I'm guessing, because this is one we all know and hate. This little alien life form from another planet, not even in our galaxy, y'all, but this is the Mexican bean beetle. and it can wreak havoc, especially later in the season with our bean crop. It is going to be the most common pest that we see with beans. And of course, window painting, I'm going to show you a picture of that here in just a few minutes. If you don't see the little yellow fuzzy, if you see that window painting effect, then you know you've got Mexican bean beetles. Now, I will always recommend being proactive through cultural controls rather than utilizing chemicals. One of the best things you can do is, as soon as that soil temperature is just right, plant those seeds. The earlier you can plant, the better you're going to be. But I will also confess here that I have often had to use chemicals, and I don't like doing that all the time, but I will often have a pretty prolific population of this, and it may be because I'm planting sequentially and, you know, I just can't get those populations under control. But I will utilize malathion. I will typically skip right over 7 for these, and I'm like I say, I think most of you that know me, I don't always turn to chemicals as a first resort, because I do try to be proactive and keep things healthy, you know, plant with proper spacing, have enough air control in there, you know, good sunlight, and trying to do everything right. But I do run into these populations usually in late July into August. And y'all know what I'm talking about when you're harvesting and you're getting all sticky. They just stick to you and everything. And I will often, when we get into the disease section here in a minute, I will often mix the malathion with Manzate, because I do have some other issues, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But make sure you refer to our organic and conventional home spray control measures. It's listed in the legumes section. It's multiple places on the web portal, so you can find it pretty much anywhere. But make sure you check that out to find out what is the best control measure for you in your specific situation. Now, another issue are aphids, and we're seeing a lot of aphid populations right now, just again because of this weather, this high humidity, these hot temperatures. We see a higher prevalence of those when the weather's like this. So you may see some aphids, but if you are incorporating some of those companion plants like I've mentioned before, if you are, you know, creating that biodynamic ecosystem in your home, lawn, garden, and landscape, then hopefully you've created a habitat for some of these beneficials. And especially the ladybug, they'll come in and eat those aphids, eat them right up. And usually aphids are not going to be a major problem for y'all. But if you see those right now, you might have to treat for those, because we do have that higher occurrence of aphids during periods of weather like this. Here is the window painting effect that I was talking about. So if you see this and you don't see the little yellow fuzzies from outer space, then this is a result of the Mexican bean beetle. So keep that in mind. A few diseases that you might see simultaneously with the Mexican bean beetle, or even just together, is going to be rust, which is a fungal disease, bacterial blights, and then anthracnose. Now, you've heard me mention anthracnose several times before in other crop specifics segments for the garden. So you know that this is something that can appear in our tomatoes and our peppers, our cucurbit crops, you know, so it can be pretty prevalent. Same thing with rust, and you'll notice here about the crop rotation. That's why we really encourage cover crops, crop rotation. You know, we're always doing these cultural controls to make sure we're lessening the occurrence of some of these issues. But with anthracnose, it's it can go back to the seed, because it can be a seed-borne illness. So make sure when you're planting these beans that they've come from a reputable source, or that they're certified and disease-free. That's really going to lessen the occurrence of this. But this is what I was talking about a few minutes ago, and you can barely see this little spot here, but this would be like a rust, a fungal disease. And then we've got the anthracnose, which is also fungal. So that's why I'll often mix the Manzate with the malathion. Malathion I'm treating for the Mexican bean beetles, and the Manzate I'm treating for the fungal pathogens here. And that will cure both of those. Now, it won't, you know, affect the bacterial blight, but if you get into a situation like this, and I do see this, but it's not usually as high occurrence as what we'll see the fungal diseases. But you can refer to this publication, or now we even have that listed in ours as well. But so that's kind of an inside look at what I'm using in my own garden, just to give you an FYI. eye. So if you have any of those issues, just give us a holler and we can try to get you pointed in the right direction if you can't find that info on the web portal. One last thing before we finish up, for harvesting purposes, of course, snap beans, we want to harvest those when the pods are tender, and just know you're going to be harvesting every couple of days. We don't want to leave those pods on too long because they'll get leathery and tough and they're just not edible at that point. Just a word of caution here, don't pick when it's wet, y'all, if that foliage is wet, because if we have disease, and maybe it's just because I know from a personal standpoint, I do run into some of these fungal issues later in the season. If that foliage is wet, then we're going to increase that occurrence of spread. So let's not do that. Let's wait till even up in the heat of the day or later in that afternoon, evening before we start picking. Also, a word of caution, for those of you that have grown beans, you know that they can be very brittle. So breaking branches with the blooms on, you know, I find myself doing that from time to time. So just be careful, use a paring knife or even scissors when you're harvesting. Just keep that in mind. If you're harvesting for Shelly beans and limas, wait until they've swelled in the pod and that pod has started to get leathery but not completely dry. So there is a fine balance there. The bean will let you know. So just let it speak to you. For dry beans, wait until the plant and the pods have completely dried out. Now, if we get into an issue, maybe wet weather coming on or even a frost coming on, then you can pull up that entire bean plant and hang it upside down somewhere and let them dry and then collect the seed. As long as it's a clean location, you don't have to cover those. If you've got an issue in a storage shed or something that you might have birds or any kind of trash getting on them, then you may want to cover like with paper bags or something like that. But typically that shouldn't be an issue. So with that, we're going to wind up legumes. This was a lot shorter than some of our other crops, but I just wanted to provide you just a little bit of a general overview, just a few things to kind of keep in mind, give you some historical context and the origins of some of these plants, and especially kind of introduce next week when we talk a little bit more about heirlooms with Bill Best. So y'all stay tuned for that. If you have any questions at all, of course, don't hesitate to reach out. mteague@utk.edu or go to bsmga.com to our Ask Us portal and submit a question there, and our team of experts will get back to you as soon as possible.